"Hello, Dad," Bruno said. He had a silly sort of mousy grin on his face. Mr. Jenkins's mouth dropped open so wide I could see the gold fillings in his back teeth. "Don't worry, Dad," Bruno went on. "It's not as bad as all that. Just so long as the cat doesn't get me." But Bruno?" stammered Mr. Jenkins. "No more school," said Bruno, grinning a broad and asinine mouse grin. "No more homework. I shall live in the kitchen cupboard and feast on raisins and honey." But Bruno," stammered Mr. Jenkins again. How did this happen?" The poor man had no wind left in his sails at all. "Witches," my grandmother said. "The witches did it." "I can't have a mouse for a son," shrieked Mr. Jenkins. "You've got one," my grandmother said. "Be nice to him, Mr. Jenkins." "Mrs. Jenkins will go crazy," yelled Mr. Jenkins. "She can't stand the things." "She'll just have to get used to him," my grandmother said. "I hope you don't keep a cat in the house." We do," cried Mr. Jenkins. "Topsy is my wife's favourite creature." "Then you'll just have to get rid of Topsy," my grandmother said. "Your son is more important than your cat." "He certainly is," Bruno shouted from inside the handbag. "You tell Mum she's got to get rid of Topsy before I go home." By now, half the dining room was watching our little group. Knives and forks and spoons had been put down, and all over the place heads were turning round to stare at Mr. Jenkins as he stood there, spluttering and shouting. They couldn't see either Bruno or me, and they were wondering what all the fuss was about. "By the way," my grandmother said, "would you like to know who did this to him?" There was a mischievous little smile on her face, and I could see that she was about to get Mr. Jenkins into trouble. "Who?" he cried. "Who did it?" "That woman over there," my grandmother said. "The small one in a black dress at the head of the long table." "She's our SPCC," cried Mr. Jenkins. "She's the chairwoman." "No, she's not," my grandmother said. "She's the Grand High Witch of all the world." "You mean she did it? That skinny little woman over there?" shouted Mr. Jenkins, pointing at her with a long finger. "By gad, I'll have my lawyers onto her for this. I'll make her pay through the nose." "I wouldn't do anything rash," my grandmother said to him. "That woman has magic powers. She might decide to turn you into something even sillier than a mouse. A cockroach, perhaps." "Turn me into a cockroach?" shouted Mr. Jenkins, puffing out his chest. "I'd like to see her try." He swung around and started marching across the dining room towards the Grand High Witch's table. My grandmother and I watched him. Bruno had jumped up onto our table and was also watching his father. Practically everyone in the dining room was watching Mr. Jenkins now. I stayed where I was, peeping out of my grandmother's handbag. I thought it might be wiser to stay put.